The southern plains of Mesopotamia stretched endlessly beneath the scorching sun, a vast expanse of mudflats and marshlands where two great rivers wound their way toward the sea. 5,000 years before the Common Era, this seemingly inhospitable landscape would witness humanity's most profound transformation. Here, between the unpredictable waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, small communities of farmers and fishermen began experimenting with new ways of organizing their societies, managing their resources, and understanding their world. The alluvial soil deposited by countless floods had created one of the most fertile regions on Earth. Each spring, when snow melted in the distant mountains of Anatolia and the Zagros Range, the rivers swelled beyond their banks, spreading nutrient-rich sediment across the floodplain. This annual renewal of the soil's fertility came at a price. The floods arrived unpredictably, sometimes too early, sometimes too late, occasionally with such violence that entire settlements vanished beneath the waters. Learning to harness this chaotic blessing would require innovations that pushed human ingenuity to its limits. The earliest inhabitants of this region left traces of their presence in the form of simple pottery shards and the foundations of mud brick houses. These Ubaid period communities, named after the archaeological site where their distinctive material culture was first identified, had already begun the long process of adapting to life in the river valley. Their settlements clustered along natural levees and slightly elevated areas that offered some protection from the annual floods. They fished in the rivers and marshes, hunted waterfowl, and cultivated small plots of barley and wheat using the simplest irrigation techniques. Archaeological evidence from sites like Eridu reveals a gradual sophistication in these early communities' approach to water management. The earliest irrigation channels were little more than shallow ditches that diverted floodwaters onto nearby fields. Over generations, these simple diversions evolved into increasingly complex networks of canals, each one carefully positioned to maximize water distribution while minimizing the risk of catastrophic flooding. The construction and maintenance of these irrigation systems required cooperation on a scale previously unknown in human society. Individual families could no longer survive in isolation. The canals that brought life-giving water to their fields required constant maintenance. Silt accumulated rapidly, threatening to choke the channels within a single growing season. Reed growth could obstruct water flow, while the burrowing of small animals weakened embankments. Communities developed work schedules that coordinated the labors of dozens or even hundreds of people, establishing patterns of collective action that would become fundamental to urban civilization. The transformation of wild grasses into productive cereal crops represented another crucial development during this period. Early farmers selected seeds from plants that displayed desirable characteristics, gradually creating varieties of wheat and barley that produced larger grains, stronger stalks, and more reliable yields. They learned to recognize subtle variations in soil quality, adjusting their planting strategies to match local conditions. Sandy soils near the rivers required different treatment than the heavy clay found further from the water. Through patient observation and experimentation, these ancient agriculturalists developed a sophisticated understanding of their environment. The domestication of animals proceeded alongside agricultural development. Sheep and goats, first tamed in the nearby Zagros Mountains, adapted well to the marshy environment of southern Mesopotamia. Cattle, though more demanding in their food and water requirements, provided not only meat and milk but also the muscle power necessary for more intensive farming. The introduction of the plough, pulled by oxen, allowed farmers to cultivate larger areas and break up the heavy clay soils that were impossible to work with simple hand tools. As agricultural productivity increased, communities could support individuals who specialized in activities other than food production. Potters developed new techniques for creating vessels that could store grain and liquids for extended periods. The potter's wheel, invented during this period, revolutionized ceramic production, enabling craftsmen to create perfectly symmetrical containers with thin walls that maximize storage capacity while minimizing weight. These vessels became essential for storing the agricultural surpluses that would sustain communities through lean seasons. Textile production emerged as another crucial specialization. The abundant reeds growing in the marshlands provided materials for baskets and mats, but it was the development of wool processing that truly transformed the economy. Sheep thrived in the Mesopotamian environment, and their wool could be spun into thread and woven into cloth of varying qualities. Women often performed this work, spending hours at their looms creating textiles that served both practical needs and as items of trade with neighboring communities. The social implications of these economic changes were profound. As some families accumulated larger herds or controlled more productive land, wealth disparities began to emerge. Archaeological excavations reveal houses of varying sizes and complexity, suggesting that social stratification was already developing during the late Ubaid period. Larger houses contained multiple rooms, storage facilities, and evidence of craft production, while smaller dwellings consisted of simple one- or two-room structures with minimal amenities. Religious practices evolved alongside these social and economic transformations. Small shrines appeared in Ubaid settlements, distinguished from ordinary houses by their central location, distinctive architecture, and the presence of ritual objects. These early temples served as focal points for community identity, places where people gathered to worship deities associated with natural forces that governed their lives. The gods of water, weather, and fertility received particular attention, as these forces directly determined agricultural success or failure. The temples also functioned as economic centers, collecting offerings from the community and redistributing them according to religious and social obligations. This system of centralized collection and redistribution would become a defining characteristic of Mesopotamian civilization. Temple administrators needed to track contributions and distributions, leading to the development of simple recording systems using clay tokens and seal impressions that would eventually evolve into writing. Trade networks expanded as communities sought materials not available in their immediate environment. Southern Mesopotamia lacked stone, metal ores, and quality timber, forcing inhabitants to establish exchange relationships with distant regions. Obsidian from Anatolia, copper from the Iranian plateau, and cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon made their way to Mesopotamian settlements through complex chains of exchange. These materials were transformed into tools, weapons, and luxury items that further reinforced social distinctions. The movement of goods required standardized measures and accounting systems. Clay tokens, representing different commodities, became increasingly sophisticated, with specific shapes denoting quantities of grain, livestock, or manufactured goods. These tokens were often enclosed in clay envelopes marked with seal impressions that identified the parties involved in transactions. This system preserved information about economic exchanges and established precedents for the contractual relationships that would become central to urban commerce. Environmental challenges continued to shape human adaptation in the region. Salinization of soils, caused by intensive irrigation in areas with poor drainage, forced communities to develop new agricultural strategies. They learned to alternate crops, leaving fields fallow to recover, and introduced salt-tolerant plants that could survive in degraded soils. Date palms, which tolerated moderate salinity while providing food, construction materials, and shade for other crops, became increasingly important in the agricultural system. The rivers themselves presented both opportunities and dangers. Their changing courses could suddenly deprive a thriving settlement of water while flooding previously dry areas. Communities learned to read subtle signs of impending channel shifts, sometimes relocating entire villages to follow the water. This mobility required social flexibility and cooperation between groups, as displaced communities needed to negotiate access to new territories and resources. Climate fluctuations added another layer of complexity to life in ancient Mesopotamia. Periods of increased rainfall brought abundant harvests but also more severe flooding. Droughts could persist for years, forcing communities to rely on stored supplies and mutual support networks. These climatic cycles taught harsh lessons about the importance of preparation and community solidarity. Settlements that successfully managed these challenges grew and prospered, while those that failed disappeared from the archaeological record. Climate fluctuations added another layer of complexity to life in ancient Mesopotamia. Periods of increased rainfall brought abundant harvests but also more severe flooding. Droughts could persist for years, forcing communities to rely on stored supplies and mutual support networks. These climatic cycles taught harsh lessons about the importance of preparation and community solidarity. Settlements that successfully managed these challenges grew and prospered, while those that failed disappeared from the archaeological record. The transition from the Ubaid period to what archaeologists recognize as the Uruk period, around 4000 BCE, marked an acceleration in social complexity and technological innovation. Settlements grew larger and more densely populated. Monumental architecture appeared, requiring unprecedented coordination of labor and resources. The simple shrines of earlier periods evolved into massive temple complexes that dominated the landscape and the social life of their communities. Population growth drove many of these changes. Improved agricultural techniques and more reliable food supplies enabled communities to support larger numbers of people. But population growth also created new pressures. Competition for productive land intensified. Water rights became sources of conflict between neighboring settlements. The need for coordinated defense against external threats encouraged communities to build walls and organize military forces. The concentration of people in larger settlements created new opportunities for innovation and specialization. Craftsmen could find sufficient demand for their products to support full-time specialization. Ideas and techniques spread more rapidly when specialists worked in close proximity. The cross-fertilization of knowledge from different craft traditions led to technological breakthroughs that would have been impossible in smaller, more isolated communities. Administrative complexity increased exponentially as settlements grew. Coordinating the activities of thousands of people required new forms of organization and record-keeping. The token system that had served small communities proved inadequate for tracking the complex transactions of emerging urban centers. Administrators needed more sophisticated methods to record not just what and how much, but also when, where, and by whom. These pressures would soon lead to one of humanity's most transformative innovations. Administrators needed more sophisticated methods to record not just what and how much, but also when, where, and by whom. These pressures would soon lead to one of humanity's most transformative innovations. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia was being fundamentally transformed. Where once small villages had dotted the banks of rivers and canals, larger settlements now dominated the horizon. Networks of canals, carefully engineered and constantly maintained, carried water to fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The marshes that had provided fish and fowl were increasingly drained and converted to agricultural land. Humanity was learning to reshape the environment to meet its needs, though the long-term consequences of these changes remained hidden in the future. Cultural practices evolved to match the new social realities. Communal festivals celebrating harvests and honoring deities became elaborate affairs involving entire settlements. These gatherings reinforced social bonds while also providing opportunities for trade, marriage negotiations, and political alliances. Artistic expression flourished as communities competed to create the most impressive temples and produce the finest craft. The distinctive pottery styles, architectural forms, and decorative motifs that emerged during this period would influence artistic traditions throughout the ancient Near East. The transformation of Uruk from a modest settlement into the world's first true city occurred with remarkable speed. Around 4000 BCE, the site covered perhaps 70 hectares, home to a few thousand inhabitants. Within 800 years, it had expanded to over 600 hectares, supporting a population that may have exceeded 50,000 people. This explosive growth represented something entirely new in human experience. No previous settlement had concentrated so many people in such a small area or required such complex systems of organization to function. The monumental architecture that arose in Uruk announced this new urban reality to anyone approaching across the flat Mesopotamian plain. The Anu district, dedicated to the sky god, rose on an artificial platform that lifted its temples above the surrounding buildings. Construction of these platforms required moving thousands of tons of earth and mud brick, a task that would have taken hundreds of workers many months to complete. The platforms served practical purposes, raising temples above flood levels, but they also made powerful statements about the community's ability to reshape the landscape through collective effort. The temples themselves displayed unprecedented architectural sophistication. The White Temple, named for its gypsum-coated walls that gleamed in the desert sun, measured over 20 meters in length and featured a tripartite design that would become standard in Mesopotamian religious architecture. A central hall, flanked by smaller chambers, created spaces for different ritual activities, while maintaining clear sight lines to the altar where the deity statue resided. The precise orientation of these buildings, aligned with celestial phenomena or cardinal directions, suggests careful planning and astronomical knowledge. Construction techniques evolved rapidly to meet the demands of monumental building projects. Builders developed standardized brick sizes that allowed for efficient production and assembly. They discovered that adding straw to mud bricks increased their strength and prevented cracking during drying. Bitumen, naturally occurring in the region, provided waterproofing for foundations and roofs. Reed mats placed between brick courses helped distribute weight and prevent settling. These innovations, developed through trial and error over generations, created buildings that could stand for centuries. The Eanna district, dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, demonstrated even greater architectural ambition. The complex covered 9 hectares and included dozens of structures serving various functions. Massive, columned halls, their pillars decorated with colored clay cones pressed into geometric patterns, could accommodate hundreds of worshippers during festivals. Administrative buildings housed the scribes and officials who managed the temple's extensive economic operations. Workshops produced textiles, pottery, and metal goods, both for temple use and for trade. These temple complexes functioned as economic powerhouses that drove urban development. They controlled vast agricultural estates worked by dependent laborers who received rations in exchange for their service. The temples collected agricultural surpluses from the surrounding countryside, storing grain in massive warehouses that could sustain the city through poor harvests or sieges. This concentration of resources allowed temples to support specialized craftsmen, maintain standing military forces, and engage in long-distance trade. The social hierarchy that emerged in Uruk reflected the new economic realities of urban life. At the apex stood the priest-kings who claimed divine authority to rule. Below them, a class of administrators, scribes, and priests managed the complex operations of temple and state. Skilled craftsmen occupied a middle tier, their specialized knowledge making them valuable to elite patrons. The majority of the population consisted of agricultural workers, construction laborers, and others who exchanged their physical labor for daily rations. Archaeological evidence reveals stark disparities in living conditions between social classes. Elite residences featured multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards, with separate areas for public reception, private family life, and servant quarters. These houses contained luxury items imported from distant lands, including lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, and cedar wood from Lebanon. In contrast, workers lived in small, single-room dwellings clustered in dense neighborhoods near the city walls, their possessions limited to basic pottery and simple tools. The concentration of wealth and power in urban centers created new forms of social organization. Extended families gave way to households organized around economic functions rather than kinship ties. Craft guilds emerged to protect the interests of specialized workers and maintain quality standards. Neighborhood associations coordinated local affairs and resolved disputes. These intermediate organizations buffered individuals from the impersonal forces of urban life while facilitating cooperation on a scale impossible in traditional village societies. The development of specialized military forces marked another crucial transformation. Earlier communities had relied on citizen militias mobilized during times of threat. Urban centers could support professional soldiers equipped with standardized weapons and trained in coordinated tactics. Bronze spears, copper helmets, and leather armor gave these forces significant advantages over less organized opponents. The ability to project military power allowed cities to control surrounding territories and extract resources from subordinate settlements. Warfare between emerging urban centers became increasingly common as cities competed for control of trade routes, water resources, and agricultural land. Fortification walls grew higher and thicker, incorporating sophisticated defensive features like towers, gates with multiple barriers, and fighting platforms for archers. Siege warfare techniques developed in response, including battering rams, scaling ladders, and undermining tactics. This arms race drove technological innovation while consuming increasing proportions of urban resources. The administrative challenges of managing urban populations spurred innovations in information management. Temple administrators needed to track thousands of economic transactions, from daily ration distributions to long-distance trade agreements. The token system that had served smaller communities proved wholly inadequate for urban record-keeping. Administrators began impressing tokens into wet clay tablets, creating permanent records that could be stored and referenced. These impressions gradually evolved into abstract symbols that represented quantities and commodities without physical tokens. The emergence of cylinder seals marked a crucial development in administrative technology. These small stone cylinders, carved with intricate designs, could be rolled across wet clay to create unique impressions that identified individuals or institutions. Seals functioned as signatures, validating documents and establishing ownership. The artistic quality of many seals suggests they also served as status symbols, with elite individuals commissioning elaborate designs that demonstrated their wealth and sophistication. Urban centers fostered unprecedented cultural exchange and innovation. Merchants, diplomats, and craftsmen from different regions converged in cities, bringing new ideas, techniques, and materials. This cross-pollination of knowledge accelerated technological development and artistic evolution. Pottery styles spread rapidly along trade routes. Architectural innovations adopted in one city appeared in others within a generation. Religious concepts and mythological narratives crossed cultural boundaries, creating shared symbolic systems that united diverse populations. The specialization of labor in cities produced remarkable advances in craft production. Potters experimented with new clay compositions and firing techniques, creating vessels of unprecedented thinness and durability. Metalworkers developed alloys that combined copper with arsenic or tin, producing bronze tools and weapons far superior to pure copper implements. Textile workers created elaborate fabrics using complex weaving patterns and dyes derived from plants, minerals, and mollusks. These luxury goods became markers of social status and items of long-distance trade. The organization of craft production evolved to meet urban demand. Individual workshops gave way to larger facilities employing multiple specialists. Master craftsmen supervised apprentices who learned techniques through years of training. Production became increasingly standardized, with workshops producing goods according to established specifications. Quality control systems emerged to maintain standards and protect reputation. These organizational innovations increased productivity while ensuring consistent quality. Religious practices adapted to urban contexts in significant ways. The intimate rituals of village shrines gave way to elaborate public ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchies and communal identity. Festival processions wound through city streets, displaying divine statues and sacred objects to assembled crowds. Sacrificial rituals, once simple offerings of grain or animals, became elaborate performances involving dozens of priests and musicians. These spectacles served political as well as religious functions, demonstrating the power of urban institutions and the divine favor they claimed. The gods themselves evolved to reflect urban realities. Deities associated with natural forces remained important, but new gods emerged representing crafts, commerce, and governance. Divine hierarchies mirrored earthly social structures, with supreme deities ruling over subordinate gods much as kings ruled over their subjects. Mythological narratives explained and justified social arrangements, presenting inequality and hierarchy as divinely ordained rather than human constructions. The intellectual ferment of urban life produced new ways of understanding the world. Observers of celestial phenomena began recording the movements of planets and stars, discovering patterns that enabled prediction of astronomical events. Mathematical knowledge expanded to meet the needs of architects, engineers, and administrators. Medical practitioners developed diagnostic techniques and treatment protocols based on systematic observation. These early scientific endeavors laid foundations for later intellectual traditions. Educational systems emerged to transmit specialized knowledge across generations. Temple schools trained scribes in the increasingly complex art of record-keeping. Craft workshops developed apprenticeship programs that preserved technical knowledge. Elite families employed tutors to educate their children in skills necessary for administrative and religious careers. This formalization of education ensured continuity of knowledge while reinforcing social stratification by limiting access to specialized training. The environmental impact of urbanization became increasingly apparent. Intensive agriculture to feed urban populations led to soil exhaustion and salinization. Deforestation to provide construction materials and fuel caused erosion and habitat loss. Industrial activities like pottery firing and metal smelting produced air pollution that affected human health. Water sources became contaminated with human and animal waste. These environmental challenges required constant adaptation and occasionally forced abandonment of settlements. Cities developed infrastructure to manage environmental problems. Drainage systems carried wastewater away from residential areas. Garbage collection services removed refuse to designated dumps outside city walls. Public wells and water distribution systems provided clean water to neighborhoods. Building codes regulated construction to prevent fire hazards and structural collapses. These municipal services required administrative coordination and funding mechanisms that further complicated urban governance. The psychological impact of urban life represented another profound transformation. For the first time in human history, people lived among strangers, conducted business with individuals they might never see again, and navigated social relationships unconstrained by kinship obligations. This anonymity created both opportunities and anxieties. Individuals could reinvent themselves, pursuing careers and relationships impossible in traditional villages. But they also faced isolation, exploitation, and uncertainty unknown in smaller communities. Urban culture developed mechanisms to manage these psychological challenges. Religious communities provided social support and identity. Professional associations offered mutual aid and protection. Neighborhood festivals and public celebrations created shared experiences that bound diverse populations. Legal systems emerged to resolve disputes between strangers. These institutional innovations helped individuals navigate the complexities of urban life while maintaining social cohesion. The success of early cities like Uruk inspired emulation throughout Mesopotamia. Settlements that had remained villages for millennia suddenly expanded, constructing monumental architecture and fortification walls. The urban model spread along trade routes carried by merchants who had witnessed the wealth and power concentrated in cities. Within a few centuries, dozens of urban centers dotted the Mesopotamian landscape, each competing for resources, population, and prestige. This proliferation of cities created new forms of regional interaction. Cities formed alliances for mutual defense and commercial advantage. Religious festivals brought representatives from multiple cities together for worship and negotiation. Diplomatic marriages created kinship networks linking urban elites. Professional specialists moved between cities, spreading knowledge and techniques. These interactions created a shared Mesopotamian culture that transcended individual urban identities while maintaining local distinctiveness. The cramped accounting rooms of Uruk's temple complexes buzzed with frustrated activity as scribes struggled to track increasingly complex economic transactions. By 3200 BCE, the token system that had served for generations was failing catastrophically. A single shipment of textiles might involve dozens of different qualities of cloth, multiple suppliers, varied payment terms, and obligations stretching across months. The hollow clay envelopes containing tokens grew so large they became unwieldy, and disputes arose when parties disagreed about what tokens had been enclosed. The breakthrough came through gradual experimentation rather than sudden inspiration. Scribes began pressing tokens directly into wet clay tablets before enclosing them, creating visible records of contents without breaking seals. Soon they realized the impressions alone sufficed, eliminating tokens entirely. These impressions evolved from faithful reproductions of token shapes into simplified marks that could be quickly drawn with a reed stylus. A circle with a wedge became the symbol for a specific grain measure. Crossed lines indicated particular quantities. Abstract marks replaced physical objects. The earliest tablets from Uruk reveal a system already sophisticated enough to record complex information. Tablet W9578 documents the distribution of barley rations to temple workers over a month-long period. Different symbols indicate job categories, from agricultural laborers to specialized craftsmen. Numerical notations record precise quantities allocated to each group. Administrative seals identify responsible officials. This single tablet preserves information that would have required hundreds of tokens to represent. The reed stylus became the scribe's essential tool, its design evolving through practical experimentation. Cut at an angle, the reed created wedge-shaped impressions when pressed into clay. Different angles and pressures produced varied marks. Scribes discovered that wedge shapes were easier to produce consistently than curved lines, leading to the angular appearance that would characterize cuneiform for 3 millennia. The stylus could create fine details or bold strokes, enabling scribes to develop personal styles while maintaining readability. Clay preparation required careful attention to achieve optimal writing surfaces. Too wet, and the stylus would sink too deeply, blurring impressions. Too dry, and the surface would crack or resist marking. Scribes mixed clay with specific proportions of water and temper, kneaded it to achieve uniform consistency, and shaped it into rectangular tablets, sized according to intended use. Small tablets recorded simple transactions. Larger ones documented complex agreements or literary compositions. The physical properties of clay influenced the development of writing conventions. The transition from pictographic to abstract representation occurred remarkably quickly. Early signs clearly depicted objects they represented. A bull's head meant cattle. Wavy lines indicated water. Human figures denoted persons. But drawing detailed pictures in clay proved time-consuming and difficult. Scribes simplified signs, reducing bullheads to triangular impressions with 2 marks for horns. Water became parallel wedges. Human figures transformed into abstract combinations of geometric shapes. These simplifications enabled faster writing while requiring readers to learn increasingly arbitrary symbol systems. Phonetic writing emerged as scribes faced the challenge of recording names and abstract concepts. The Sumerian word for arrow, ti, sounded identical to the word for life. Scribes began using the arrow symbol to represent both meanings depending on context. This rebus principle opened revolutionary possibilities. Any word could be written by combining symbols representing similar-sounding syllables. Abstract concepts, foreign names, and grammatical particles could all be expressed through phonetic writing. The Sumerian language's structure profoundly influenced how writing developed. As an agglutinative language, Sumerian built complex meanings by adding particles to root words. A single verb might incorporate elements indicating subject, object, direction, manner, and tense. Writing systems needed to represent these grammatical elements efficiently. Scribes developed conventions for indicating word boundaries, grammatical relationships, and semantic categories. Determinatives, silent symbols that classified words, helped readers distinguish between homonyms. Administrative needs drove continuous refinement of the writing system. Temple accounts required precise notation of quantities, dates, and responsible parties. Legal documents demanded unambiguous language to prevent disputes. Diplomatic correspondence needed formal conventions to maintain appropriate protocol. Each application pushed scribes to develop new techniques and expand the system's capabilities. Writing evolved from simple accounting tool to comprehensive communication medium. The social implications of literacy transformed Mesopotamian society. Scribes occupied essential positions in every major institution. Without their skills, temples could not manage estates, palaces could not administer territories, and merchants could not conduct long-distance trade. This indispensability gave scribes considerable influence despite their generally non-elite origins. Many scribes came from middle-class families who could afford the years of education required for literacy. Their skills provided social mobility unavailable through other professions. Scribal education began in childhood and continued for years. Students first learned to form basic wedges, practicing on recycled tablets that could be moistened and smoothed for reuse. They progressed to copying simple signs, then syllable combinations, and finally, complete words. Lexical lists, organized compilations of related terms, served as teaching tools and reference works. Students memorized thousands of sign combinations and their meanings. Mathematical training accompanied literacy education, as scribes needed numeracy for administrative work. The curriculum extended beyond technical skills to include literature, religious texts, and professional ethics. Students copied proverbs that transmitted cultural values. They transcribed hymns that reinforced religious beliefs. They studied legal formulas essential for drafting contracts. Advanced students composed original texts, demonstrating mastery of literary conventions and stylistic techniques. This comprehensive education produced intellectuals capable of preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge across generations. Educational methods revealed through surviving school tablets show sophisticated pedagogical approaches. Teachers used repetition and graduated exercises to build skills systematically. Students progressed from copying individual signs to reproducing entire texts. Corrections on student tablets indicate active instruction and feedback. Dialogue texts between teachers and students suggest interactive learning environments. Humorous compositions about school life provide glimpses of student experiences, including complaints about difficult lessons and strict teachers. The physical spaces of scribal schools reflected their importance in urban society. Excavations at Nippur uncovered dedicated school buildings with rows of benches where students sat cross-legged, tablets on their laps. Storage areas contained reference texts and practice tablets. Central courtyards provided light for detailed work. These schools operated within temple complexes or near administrative centers, emphasizing the connection between literacy and institutional power. Professional scribes specialized in different domains. Temple scribes focused on religious texts and economic records. Palace scribes handled diplomatic correspondence and royal inscriptions. Legal scribes drafted contracts and recorded court proceedings. Literary scribes composed and copied creative works. Each specialization required specific knowledge beyond basic literacy. Legal scribes memorized formulaic language and precedents. Religious scribes learned archaic vocabulary and ritual terminology. This specialization created distinct scribal traditions with their own training methods and professional standards. Writing materials influenced textual practices in profound ways. Clay tablets were durable but bulky, encouraging concise expression. Important documents were baked in kilns, creating permanent records that survive millennia later. Everyday tablets were often recycled, moistened, and smoothed for reuse. This recycling means many temporary records are lost to history. The documents that survive disproportionately represent formal, official, or literary texts, deemed worth permanent preservation. The development of archives and libraries reflected writing's growing importance. Temples and palaces constructed dedicated storage rooms with shelving systems for organizing tablets. Archivists developed filing conventions using basket labels, tablet colophons, and summary documents. Large institutions might maintain thousands of tablets requiring sophisticated retrieval systems. The ability to reference previous documents transformed administrative practice, enabling complex long-term planning and institutional memory. Literary composition flourished as writing matured beyond administrative applications. Scribes began recording oral traditions, preserving myths, legends, and historical narratives previously transmitted through memory. The act of writing transformed these traditions. Oral poetry relies on repetition, formulaic phrases, and episodic structure to aid memorization. Written literature could employ more complex narrative structures, subtle wordplay, and intricate imagery. New literary forms emerged that exploited writing's unique capabilities. The earliest literary texts from Mesopotamia include hymns praising deities and temples. These compositions employed sophisticated poetic techniques, including parallelism, where successive lines repeated and varied themes. Alliteration and assonance created musical effects even in written form. Metaphorical language conveyed complex theological concepts. These hymns served religious functions while demonstrating scribal artistry. The ability to compose elegant literature became a mark of advanced scribal education. Historical writing emerged as scribes began recording contemporary events for posterity. Royal inscriptions commemorated military victories and building projects. Year names used for dating purposes preserved memories of significant events. King lists traced dynastic succession across centuries. These historical texts mixed factual documentation with ideological propaganda, presenting events from perspectives favorable to current rulers. The creation of written history fundamentally changed how societies understood their past and imagined their future. Legal applications of writing revolutionized justice systems. Written law codes provided consistent standards across jurisdictions. Contracts created enforceable agreements between parties. Court records preserved precedents for future cases. The ability to document legal proceedings reduced reliance on witness testimony and memory. Written law did not eliminate corruption or ensure justice, but it created frameworks for systematic legal practice that oral traditions could not support. The spread of literacy remained limited throughout Sumerian history. Estimates suggest less than 1% of the population could read and write. This restriction meant scribes served as intermediaries between literate institutions and illiterate populations. People relied on professional scribes to draft contracts, read official documents, and communicate with authorities. This dependence created opportunities for exploitation, but also established scribes as essential facilitators of urban life. Writing's impact extended far beyond those who could read. Written records enabled institutions to function at unprecedented scales. Written laws provided standards even for those who could not read them. Written literature preserved cultural traditions accessible through public recitation. Written contracts facilitated commerce between strangers. The indirect effects of literacy transformed society even for the illiterate majority. Different writing systems emerged for specific purposes. Administrative texts employed abbreviated formats and specialized terminology. Literary texts used elaborate sign forms and archaic vocabulary. Monumental inscriptions featured decorative scripts designed for visual impact. Personal letters developed informal conventions distinct from official correspondence. These varied systems reflected writing's adaptation to diverse communicative needs. The preservation of written knowledge required continuous effort. Clay tablets were durable but could break, wear, or become illegible. Scribes regularly copied important texts to ensure preservation. This copying process introduced variations as scribes made errors, updated language, or added commentary. The texts that survive today have often passed through multiple generations of copying, each potentially altering the original. Understanding these transmission processes is crucial for interpreting ancient documents. Translation became necessary as writing spread to speakers of different languages. Akkadian speakers adapted cuneiform to write their Semitic language, requiring significant modifications to represent different phonological and grammatical structures. Bilingual scribes created dictionaries and grammatical texts to facilitate translation. The ability to write multiple languages enabled diplomatic correspondence, international trade, and cultural exchange. Writing became a bridge between linguistic communities. The cognitive impact of literacy transformed how people thought about language and communication. Writing made language visible, enabling analysis of grammatical structures and semantic relationships. Scribes developed explicit understanding of linguistic phenomena that remained intuitive for non-literate speakers. This metalinguistic awareness influenced how languages evolved and how new concepts were expressed. Writing did not merely record language, but actively shaped its development. The early dynastic period of Sumerian history, spanning roughly from 2900 to 2350 BCE, witnessed political fragmentation that paradoxically drove cultural and technological advancement. Where once Uruk had dominated the southern Mesopotamian plain, now dozens of independent city-states competed for resources, territory, and prestige. Each city claimed its own patron deity, maintained its own army, and pursued its own territorial ambitions. This multipolar system created constant tension that spurred innovation in governance, warfare, and diplomatic practice. The concept of kingship evolved significantly during this era. Earlier rulers had derived authority primarily from religious roles, serving as intermediaries between communities and their gods. Now, kings increasingly emphasized military prowess and territorial conquest as sources of legitimacy. The title Lugal, meaning great man, became associated with war leadership, while the traditional Ensi designation retained religious connotations. Some rulers claimed both titles, combining sacred and military authority, while others specialized in one domain. Royal ideology developed elaborate justifications for monarchical power. Kings claimed divine selection, presenting themselves as chosen by patron deities to maintain cosmic order. Royal inscriptions described kings as shepherds protecting their flocks, gardeners tending their cities, and warriors defending civilization against chaos. These metaphors naturalized hierarchy and inequality as necessary for social functioning. The concept of divine kingship did not emerge fully formed, but developed through centuries of experimentation with different legitimating strategies. the city-state of Lagash provides exceptional documentation of early dynastic political organization through thousands of administrative tablets and royal inscriptions. Under rulers like Irnatum and Entemena, Lagash expanded its territory through military conquest while developing sophisticated administrative systems. The famous Stele of Vultures, commissioned by Irnatum around 2450 BCE, depicts the king leading his troops in tight phalanx formation while vultures devour enemy corpses. The accompanying inscription frames military victory as divine judgment, with the god Ningirsu granting victory to his chosen representative. Competition between Lagash and its neighbor Umma over the fertile Gwadina plain exemplified the territorial conflicts that characterized the period. Both cities claimed divine sanction for their territorial claims, citing ancient agreements supposedly established by the gods themselves. The conflict persisted for generations, with temporary victories and peace treaties repeatedly giving way to renewed warfare. These conflicts drove military innovation as cities developed new tactics and technologies to gain advantages over rivals. Military organization became increasingly sophisticated during the early dynastic period. Professional soldiers replaced citizen militias as the backbone of urban armies. These professionals trained regularly in formation fighting and siege techniques. The development of bronze weapons and armor gave properly equipped forces significant advantages. Chariots drawn by donkeys provided mobile platforms for commanders and shock troops. Military specialization extended to support personnel, including armorsmiths, engineers, and supply officers who maintained armies during extended campaigns. Fortification architecture evolved in response to advancing siege techniques. City walls grew higher and thicker, incorporating projecting towers that allowed defenders to attack besiegers from multiple angles. Gates became elaborate defensive complexes with multiple barriers, guard chambers, and killing zones where attackers could be trapped. Some cities constructed double walls with cleared zones between them, creating additional defensive depth. These fortifications required enormous investments of labor and resources, demonstrating the priority cities placed on defense. The royal cemetery at Ur, excavated in the 1920s, revealed the wealth and power concentrated in early dynastic royal courts. The tomb of Queen Puabi contained extraordinary treasures including elaborate golden headdresses, musical instruments decorated with precious metals and stones, and furniture inlaid with elaborate designs. Most dramatically, dozens of attendants were buried with royal corpses, apparently sacrificed to serve rulers in the afterlife. These mass burials suggest beliefs about royal divinity that transcended death. The practice of retainer sacrifice reflected extreme social stratification. The attendants buried with royalty included soldiers, musicians, servants, and administrators, each positioned according to their roles in life. Some appear to have died peacefully, perhaps poisoned, while others show signs of violence. The careful arrangement of bodies and grave goods indicates elaborate funeral ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchies even in death. This practice disappeared after the early dynastic period, suggesting evolving concepts of royal authority and afterlife beliefs. Diplomatic practices developed to manage relations between city-states. Treaties established territorial boundaries, trade agreements, and military alliances. Marriage alliances created kinship ties between royal families, though these rarely prevented conflicts when strategic interests diverged. Diplomatic correspondence followed elaborate protocols with standardized greetings, titles, and formulaic language. Ambassadors enjoyed protected status, at least theoretically, allowing communication even between hostile powers. Religious institutions maintained significant autonomy despite growing royal power. Major temples controlled vast agricultural estates, operated workshops, and conducted long-distance trade independently of palace administration. The relationship between palace and temple varied across cities and periods. Sometimes kings dominated religious institutions, appointing relatives as high priests, and appropriating temple resources. Other times, temples successfully resisted royal encroachment, maintaining economic and political independence. The Sumerian pantheon crystallized during the early dynastic period into a complex system of deities with specialized functions and elaborate mythologies. Anu ruled as king of the gods from his celestial palace. Enlil controlled earth and atmosphere, decreeing fates of cities and rulers. Enki governed wisdom and fresh water, providing humanity with civilizing knowledge. Inanna Ishtar embodied both love and war, reflecting the period's violent yet culturally sophisticated character. These major deities were supported by hundreds of minor gods, demons, and protective spirits. Mythological narratives explained natural phenomena, justified social arrangements, and provided moral guidance. Creation myths described how gods established order from primordial chaos, providing templates for royal authority. Flood stories warned of divine punishment for human wickedness while promising survival for the righteous. Epic tales of heroes like Gilgamesh explored themes of friendship, mortality, and the limits of human ambition. These narratives were preserved in multiple versions, each reflecting the perspectives and interests of different cities and periods. Religious festivals punctuated the annual calendar, providing occasions for communal celebration and reinforcing social bonds. The Akitu New Year festival involved elaborate ceremonies including ritual battles between cosmic forces, sacred marriages ensuring fertility, and renewal of royal authority. These festivals required extensive preparation and resources involving entire populations in collective religious expression. Processions displayed divine statues and sacred objects, making visible the normally hidden presence of gods within communities. Temple architecture reached new heights of elaboration during the early dynastic period. The tradition of building temples on raised platforms evolved into true ziggurats, massive stepped structures that dominated urban skylines. These artificial mountains brought temples closer to the heavens while demonstrating the community's devotion and organizational capacity. Construction required coordinated labor from thousands of workers and consumed enormous quantities of materials. The investment represented in these structures testified to religion's central importance in Sumerian society. Artistic production flourished under royal and temple patronage. Sculptors created remarkably naturalistic statues depicting rulers, deities, and worshippers. The famous votive statues from Tel Asmar show figures with enlarged eyes gazing perpetually at their gods, their hands clasped in eternal prayer. These sculptures display individual characteristics, suggesting attempts at portraiture rather than generic representation. The technical skill required to carve hard stones like diorite with bronze tools demonstrates remarkable craftsmanship. Relief sculpture decorated temples and palaces with narrative scenes celebrating royal achievements and religious themes. The Ur-Nanshi plaque from Lagash shows the king carrying a basket of bricks for temple construction, emphasizing royal piety and service to the gods. Battle scenes depicted victories over enemies, reinforcing royal military prowess. These reliefs served both decorative and propagandistic functions, communicating political and religious messages to literate and illiterate audiences alike. Metalworking achieved extraordinary sophistication during the early dynastic period. Craftsmen mastered techniques including casting, hammering, engraving, and inlay work. The golden helmet of Mescalamduk from Ur was beaten from a single sheet of gold alloy, its surface decorated to simulate elaborate hairstyling. Musical instruments featured golden and silver decorations depicting mythological scenes. Weapons combined functional effectiveness with artistic elaboration, serving as both tools of war and symbols of status. Cylinder seals became miniature masterpieces of artistic expression. Despite their tiny size, these seals displayed complex scenes with multiple figures, architectural elements, and inscriptions. Seal carvers developed distinctive styles that allow modern scholars to identify regional schools and individual artists. The scenes depicted on seals provide invaluable evidence about religious beliefs, social practices, and daily life. Common themes included banquet scenes, religious ceremonies, mythological narratives, and geometric patterns. Pottery production, while less spectacular than metalwork or sculpture, reveals important information about economic and social organization. Standardized forms mass-produced in workshops indicate centralized production and distribution systems. Decoration styles varied between cities, suggesting distinct regional traditions. The quality differences between elite and common pottery reflect social stratification. Changes in pottery styles over time provide chronological markers that help date archaeological sites. Textile production became increasingly important during the early dynastic period, though few examples survive due to organic decomposition. Artistic representations and textual references indicate elaborate garments decorated with complex patterns. Different styles of dress marked social status, occupation, and religious roles. The production of fine textiles required specialized skills and equipment, making textile workers valuable specialists. Trade in finished textiles connected Sumerian cities with distant regions. Music and performance played important roles in religious and court life. Artistic representations show musicians playing harps, lyres, drums, and wind instruments. The instruments discovered in royal tombs were elaborately decorated with precious materials, indicating music's high status. Musicians appear to have been professionals attached to temples and palaces. Musical performances accompanied religious ceremonies, royal banquets, and public festivals. The development of musical notation systems, while not fully understood, suggests sophisticated musical traditions. Literary composition flourished as scribes moved beyond administrative writing to create artistic works. Hymns praising gods and kings employed elaborate poetic techniques, including repetition, parallelism, and metaphor. Prayers and lamentations expressed religious devotion and communal suffering. Wisdom literature offered moral guidance and practical advice. Proverbs preserved folk wisdom in memorable forms. These compositions demonstrate linguistic sophistication and aesthetic sensibility that belie common stereotypes about ancient societies. The early dynastic period saw the composition of literary works that would remain influential for millennia. Early versions of stories later incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh appeared during this time. The Sumerian king list, though compiled later, preserves traditions about early dynastic rulers that mix historical information with mythological elements. These texts established narrative patterns and themes that would influence subsequent Near Eastern and world literature. Educational practices evolved to transmit increasingly complex cultural knowledge. Scribal schools expanded their curricula beyond basic literacy to include mathematics, literature, music, and ritual knowledge. Students progressed through graduated exercises that built skills systematically. Advanced education produced scholar scribes capable of composing original works and preserving ancient traditions. The concentration of education in temples and palaces reinforced connections between literacy, power, and religious authority. The northern Mesopotamian city of Kish had long served as a significant power center, but around 2334 BCE, its royal court witnessed an unprecedented transformation. Sargon, whose name meant legitimate king, suggesting it was adopted rather than given at birth, rose from obscure origins to seize power through methods that remain historically unclear. Later legends described him as a foundling discovered floating in a reed basket, raised by a gardener and beloved by the goddess Ishtar. Whatever his actual origins, Sargon possessed military genius and political vision that would reshape the ancient Near East. Sargon's initial consolidation of power in Kish required eliminating rivals and securing the loyalty of the military. Unlike traditional Sumerian rulers who derived authority from religious positions or hereditary succession, Sargon built his power base through personal charisma and military success. He recruited soldiers from diverse ethnic backgrounds, creating a professional army loyal to him personally rather than to traditional institutions. This military force, equipped with standardized bronze weapons and trained in coordinated tactics, proved superior to the citizen militias of Sumerian city-states. The conquest of southern Mesopotamia proceeded systematically as Sargon exploited divisions between Sumerian cities. Lugal-Zagezi of Uruk had recently unified much of Sumer under his control, but his confederation remained fragile. Sargon defeated Lugal-Zagezi in battle, allegedly capturing him along with 50 other governors in a single campaign. The victor paraded his prestigious captive in a neck stock to Nippur, demonstrating his dominance over traditional Sumerian authority. This symbolic humiliation sent clear messages about the new political order Sargon intended to establish. The strategic brilliance of Sargon's campaigns lay not merely in military tactics but in his understanding of economic and political structures. Rather than simply plundering conquered cities, he incorporated them into an administrative system that preserved local economies while redirecting surpluses to support his imperial ambitions. Local governors were replaced with Akkadian administrators who reported directly to Sargon, but lower-level bureaucracies often remained intact. This approach minimized disruption while ensuring central control over resources and information. Akkad, Sargon's capital, became the center of the world's first multi-ethnic empire. Though its precise location remains unknown despite extensive archaeological surveys, textual sources describe a magnificent city where diverse populations mingled. Merchants from across the known world brought goods to Akkad's markets. Craftsmen from different traditions worked side by side, creating cultural fusion in artistic styles and technical practices. The city's cosmopolitan character reflected the empire's unprecedented geographic extent and cultural diversity. The Akkadian language, previously confined to northern Mesopotamia, became the administrative tongue of the empire. This Semitic language differed fundamentally from Sumerian in structure and vocabulary. Where Sumerian built meaning through agglutination, Akkadian used root patterns and vowel changes to indicate grammatical relationships. Scribes faced the challenge of adapting cuneiform, designed for Sumerian, to represent Akkadian's different phonological system. They developed new conventions for syllabic writing while maintaining logograms for common concepts. Cultural synthesis between Sumerian and Akkadian traditions created innovations in art, literature, and religious practice. Akkadian rulers adopted Sumerian titles and religious ceremonies while introducing their own cultural elements. The goddess Ishtar, Akkadian counterpart to Sumerian Inanna, gained prominence throughout the empire. Mythological narratives were translated and adapted, creating hybrid versions that incorporated elements from both traditions. This cultural fusion established patterns that would characterize Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. Sargon's military campaigns extended far beyond traditional Mesopotamian boundaries. Inscriptions claim he conquered territories from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea, referring to the Mediterranean and Persian Gulf. While some claims may be exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms Akkadian presence in Syria, Anatolia, and western Iran. These campaigns were not mere raids, but systematic efforts to control trade routes and resource extraction. The cedar forests of Lebanon, the silver mines of Anatolia, and the lapis lazuli sources of Afghanistan all came under Akkadian influence. The logistics of maintaining such an extensive empire required revolutionary administrative innovations. Provincial governors collected standardized taxes in grain, livestock, and manufactured goods. These resources were redistributed to support the military, fund construction projects, and maintain trade relationships. A postal system using relay stations enabled rapid communication across vast distances. Standard weights and measures facilitated commerce and taxation. These administrative tools allowed central authorities to monitor and control activities thousands of kilometers from the capital. Military organization under the Akkadian Empire reached unprecedented sophistication. The standing army included specialized units of archers, spearmen, and siege engineers. Akkadian forces employed combined arms tactics, coordinating different unit types for maximum effectiveness. The famous victory stele of Naram Sin shows disciplined troops ascending mountain paths in formation, demonstrating the army's ability to operate in difficult terrain. Military colonies were established in conquered territories, providing security while spreading Akkadian culture. Naram Sin, Sargon's grandson, pushed Akkadian power to its zenith during his reign from approximately 2254 to 2218 BCE. His military campaigns exceeded even Sargon's achievements, reaching into the Iranian highlands and possibly as far as the Indus Valley. But Naram Sin's most radical innovation was his assumption of divine status. Previous Mesopotamian rulers had claimed divine selection and support, but Naram Sin declared himself a god, demanding worship from his subjects. His name was written with the divine determinative, and temples were dedicated to his cult. The deification of Naram Sin represented a fundamental transformation in concepts of political authority. By claiming divinity, he placed himself beyond traditional constraints on royal power. No earthly authority could challenge a god-king's decisions. This theological innovation provided ideological justification for absolute rule, but also created tensions with established religious institutions. Traditional temples were forced to acknowledge the divinity of a living ruler, disrupting theological systems that had separated human and divine realms. Art produced during Naram Sin's reign displayed exceptional technical skill and innovative compositions. The victory stele of Naram Sin abandoned traditional registers in favor of a unified composition showing the king ascending toward celestial symbols. The ruler appears larger than other figures, wearing a horned helmet signifying divinity. The naturalistic representation of landscape and the dynamic arrangement of figures demonstrated artistic sophistication that influenced subsequent Near Eastern art. Portrait sculptures achieved remarkable realism, possibly representing actual individuals rather than idealized types. The bronze head, discovered at Nineveh, possibly depicting Naram Sin or another Akkadian ruler, exemplifies the period's artistic achievements. Cast using the lost wax technique, the head displays subtle modeling of facial features and elaborate representation of hair and beard. The eyes, originally inlaid with precious stones, would have created a lifelike appearance. The technical mastery required for such work indicates specialized workshops with accumulated expertise in metallurgy and artistic design. Economic prosperity under Akkadian rule enabled unprecedented cultural production. Long-distance trade flourished as political stability reduced risks for merchants. Standardized weights, measures, and currency facilitated commercial transactions. Urban workshops produced luxury goods for elite consumption and export. Agricultural productivity increased through improved irrigation systems and administrative efficiency. This economic foundation supported specialized craftsmen, artists, and scholars who advanced Mesopotamian culture. The Akkadian Empire's linguistic policies had lasting consequences for Near Eastern culture. While Sumerian remained important for religious and scholarly purposes, Akkadian became the language of administration, diplomacy, and commerce. Bilingual education produced scribes fluent in both languages, facilitating cultural transmission. Literary works were translated between languages, creating multiple versions that preserved different perspectives. This bilingual tradition established precedents for multilingual administration that subsequent empires would follow. Religious syncretism under Akkadian rule merged Sumerian and Akkadian theological concepts. Deities were equated across traditions, with Sumerian Inanna becoming Akkadian Ishtar, Sumerian Utu becoming Akkadian Shamash. These identifications were not simple translations but complex theological negotiations that transformed both traditions. New mythological narratives explained relationships between previously separate pantheons. Ritual practices combined elements from different traditions, creating hybrid forms that satisfied diverse populations. The environmental challenges that contributed to the Akkadian Empire, its eventual collapse, began manifesting during Naram-Sin's later years. Paleoclimatic evidence indicates a severe drought beginning around 2200 BCE that disrupted agricultural production across Mesopotamia. Reduced crop yields strained the empire's redistribution systems. Provincial territories became increasingly difficult to control as local populations struggled for survival. The centralized administration that had been Akkadian strength became vulnerability when environmental conditions deteriorated. The Gutian invasions that ultimately destroyed Akkadian power originated in the Zagros Mountains. These mountain peoples had long been marginalized by Mesopotamian expansion, their territories exploited for resources, while their populations were excluded from urban prosperity. As Akkadian control weakened, Gutian groups united under military leaders who understood Mesopotamian warfare through generations of conflict. Their campaigns combined mountain warfare expertise with captured Mesopotamian military technology. Gutian forces employed different strategies than traditional Mesopotamian armies. Rather than besieging fortified cities, they destroyed agricultural infrastructure, making urban centers unsustainable. Hit-and-run tactics exhausted Akkadian forces trained for set-piece battles. Control of mountain passes disrupted trade routes essential for urban economies. The Gutians demonstrated that empire's apparent strength could become weakness when faced with unconventional threats. The destruction of Akkad itself remains archaeologically unverified since the city's location is unknown. Textual sources describe comprehensive devastation, with the city abandoned and cursed. The Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian poem composed after the empire's fall, attributes destruction to divine punishment for Naram-Sin's sacrilege. This theological explanation provided meaning for traumatic events while warning future rulers against exceeding proper boundaries. The poem's survival in multiple copies indicates its importance for Mesopotamian historical memory. The Gutian period following Akkadian collapse witnessed dramatic decline in urban culture. Monumental construction ceased. Long-distance trade networks fragmented. Literary production declined sharply. The Gutians, lacking administrative experience, could not maintain the complex systems that supported Mesopotamian civilization. Their rule, remembered in Sumerian sources as a dark age of barbarism and chaos, lasted approximately 60 years. Yet this characterization may reflect bias of Sumerian authors who eventually expelled Gutian rulers. Despite political collapse, certain Akkadian innovations survived through local preservation. Scribal schools in cities that maintained autonomy continued teaching Akkadian alongside Sumerian. Administrative practices developed under the empire were remembered and sometimes maintained at reduced scales. Artistic techniques and styles influenced local traditions even during political fragmentation. The Akkadian experiment in universal empire left intellectual and cultural legacies that transcended its political failure. The memory of Akkadian glory profoundly influenced subsequent Mesopotamian rulers. Later, kings claimed descent from Sargon or compared their achievements to his. The figure of Sargon became legendary, with stories of his campaigns growing more fantastic with each retelling. Naram-Sin appeared in cautionary tales about hubris and divine punishment. These historical memories, blending fact with fiction, shaped Mesopotamian concepts of kingship and empire for centuries after Akkadian collapse. The political fragmentation that followed Akkadian collapse created opportunities for local strongmen to establish regional power bases. In the southern city of Lagash, a governor named Gudea emerged around 2144 BCE as one of the most successful rulers of this transitional period. Unlike the Gutian overlords who controlled much of northern Mesopotamia, Gudea understood that legitimate authority required more than military force. His reign demonstrated how traditional Sumerian values could be revitalized even under foreign domination. Gudea's building programs rivaled those of earlier great kings, despite controlling only a modest territory. His reconstruction of the Aninnu temple complex dedicated to Ningirsu required importing materials from across the known world. Cedar beams came from Lebanon's mountains, stone from the Arabian Peninsula, gold from Anatolia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. These acquisitions during a period of political chaos demonstrated sophisticated diplomatic and commercial capabilities. Gudea negotiated safe passage through territories controlled by various local powers, maintaining trade relationships that had seemed impossible after Akkadian collapse. The numerous diorite statues of Gudea discovered at Lagash represent extraordinary artistic achievements. Carved from extremely hard stone, imported from Magan, these sculptures required exceptional technical skill. Each statue presents Gudea in a posture of piety, hands clasped, eyes focused on the divine. Inscriptions covering the statue's surfaces describe building projects and divine visions in elaborate Sumerian poetry. The texts employ archaic language and complex literary devices, demonstrating that scholarly traditions survived political disruption. The literary quality of Gudea's inscriptions reveals sophisticated intellectual culture persisting in Lagash. His scribes composed texts that balanced historical documentation with theological interpretation. Dreams in which gods provided architectural plans legitimized construction projects. Mathematical precision in recording measurements demonstrated administrative competence. These texts served multiple audiences, from literate elites who appreciated literary artistry to gods who required proper acknowledgement of their authority. While Gudea maintained Lagash's prosperity, other Sumerian cities began asserting independence from Gutian control. The process accelerated when Utu-Hagal of Uruk organized a coalition that expelled Gutian forces around 2120 BCE. His victory inscriptions describe divinely sanctioned campaigns that restored Sumerian independence. Yet Utu-Hagal's triumph proved temporary. His general Ur-Nammu seized power and established the third dynasty of Ur, creating the most centralized state Mesopotamia had yet witnessed. Ur-Nammu's rise to power around 2112 BCE initiated what modern scholars call the Ur-III period, characterized by unprecedented bureaucratic sophistication. Unlike earlier empires that relied on military force and personal loyalty, the Ur-III state functioned through systematic administrative procedures. Every aspect of economic life came under state control. Agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and commercial exchange all operated according to centralized plans. This system generated enormous archives that provide extraordinary detail about ancient administrative practices. The administrative capital at Ur became the nerve center of an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Zagros Mountains. Officials throughout the realm sent regular reports to the capital, documenting everything from grain harvests to workshop production. These reports were compiled, analyzed, and archived by armies of scribes who maintained the information systems essential for imperial administration. The scale of record-keeping exceeded anything previously attempted, with some archives containing hundreds of thousands of tablets. Provincial organization under Ur III divided the empire into approximately 20 provinces, each governed by an ensi appointed by the king. These governors possessed limited autonomy, their actions constrained by detailed regulations and constant oversight. Regular inspections by royal officials ensured compliance with central directives, Provincial governors who exceeded their authority or failed to meet quotas faced removal and punishment. This systematic control prevented the fragmentation that had weakened earlier empires. The Drehem Redistribution Center exemplified Ur-III administrative sophistication. Located near Nippur, this facility processed livestock collected as taxes from throughout the empire. Animals arrived from provinces according to carefully calculated schedules. Scribes recorded each delivery, noting quantity, quality, and origin. The livestock were then redistributed to temples, royal establishments, and military units according to predetermined allocations. Over 40,000 tablets from Drehem document this operation's extraordinary complexity. Shulgi, who succeeded Ur-Nammu and ruled for 48 years, transformed his father's administrative framework into the ancient world's most sophisticated bureaucracy. His reforms standardized weights, measures, and calendar systems throughout the empire. Provincial boundaries were redrawn to optimize administrative efficiency. Legal procedures were codified to ensure consistent justice. These reforms created institutional structures that functioned independently of individual rulers, providing stability that previous empires had lacked. Educational reforms under Shulgi expanded scribal training to meet the bureaucracy's growing demands. Schools were established in major cities, following standardized curricula that ensured consistent administrative practices. Students progressed through graduated exercises, from basic literacy to advanced mathematical and legal training. The most capable graduates entered specialized training for particular administrative roles. This educational system produced thousands of literate administrators who staffed the imperial bureaucracy. The legal code promulgated by Ur-Nammu and expanded by Shulgi represented a significant advance in jurisprudence. Unlike later codes that emphasized retribution, Ur-III law preferred monetary compensation for most offenses. This approach reflected the state, economic orientation, and its preference for maintaining productive capacity rather than inflicting physical punishment. The code addressed property rights, family relationships, and commercial transactions with remarkable detail, providing frameworks for resolving disputes that arose in complex urban societies. Economic organization under Ur-III achieved unprecedented sophistication. State workshops employed thousands of workers producing textiles, pottery, metalwork, and other goods. Production quotas were calculated based on available materials and labor. Distribution systems ensured products reached intended recipients. Quality control mechanisms maintained standards. This centrally planned economy achieved remarkable efficiency, supporting large populations and funding massive construction projects. The textile industry exemplified Ur-III economic management. Workshops in cities like Girsu employed over 6,000 workers, primarily women and children. Raw wool arrived according to scheduled deliveries. Workers received specific production assignments based on skill levels. Finished textiles were graded by quality and distributed according to predetermined allocations. Some went to temple personnel as payment, others to military forces as equipment, still others to merchants for export trade. Every transaction was documented, creating comprehensive records of industrial production. Agricultural management under Ur-III systematized farming practices across diverse ecological zones. State officials monitored field conditions, determined planting schedules, and allocated irrigation water. Crop yields were carefully recorded and compared against expected returns. Fields that underperformed were investigated to determine causes and implement improvements. This scientific approach to agriculture increased productivity while maintaining soil fertility through careful management. The irrigation systems maintained by Ur-III represented engineering achievements that would not be surpassed for centuries. Major canals were dredged regularly to maintain water flow. Distribution channels were constructed according to precise gradients that optimized water delivery. Control structures regulated flow rates to prevent erosion while ensuring adequate irrigation. The labor required for system maintenance was coordinated across provinces, with communities contributing workers according to the benefits they received from irrigation infrastructure. Temple institutions under Ur III maintained significant autonomy despite state control. Major temples owned vast estates, operated workshops, and conducted long-distance trade. Temple administrators were integrated into the state bureaucracy, but retained distinct institutional identities. This accommodation between religious and state authority prevented conflicts that might have destabilized the empire. Temples provided ideological legitimation for royal authority while maintaining their traditional economic and social functions. The construction of the great ziggurat at Ur demonstrated the resources available to Ur III rulers. This massive structure, rising in 3 stages to approximately 30 meters, required millions of mud bricks and thousands of workers. The exterior was faced with fired bricks set in bitumen mortar, providing weather protection that enabled the structure to survive millennia. Interior drainage systems prevented water damage. The engineering precision required for such construction revealed accumulated knowledge from centuries of monumental building. Urban planning in Ur III cities reflected systematic approaches to organizing space. Residential neighborhoods were separated from industrial areas, commercial districts clustered near harbors, and major thoroughfares. Administrative buildings occupied central locations. Streets followed regular patterns that facilitated movement and drainage. This rational organization contrasted with the organic growth patterns of earlier cities, demonstrating centralized planning capabilities. The harbor at Ur revealed sophisticated understanding of maritime commerce. Excavations uncovered substantial port facilities including quays, warehouses, and administrative buildings. The harbor could accommodate numerous vessels simultaneously, with separate areas for loading and unloading. Customs officials recorded all shipments, collecting duties that provided significant state revenue. The harbor's connection to the Persian Gulf via canals enabled long-distance trade that brought exotic goods from India, Arabia, and East Africa. Military organization under Ur III balanced professional forces with provincial levies. The standing army included specialized units trained for different combat roles. Provincial governors maintained local forces that could be mobilized for major campaigns. Military colonies in frontier regions provided security while spreading Sumerian culture. This flexible system enabled rapid response to threats while avoiding the expense of maintaining large permanent armies. Despite its sophisticated administration, the Ur III state contained inherent weaknesses that eventually caused its collapse. The bureaucracy's complexity created rigidities that prevented rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Provincial governors accumulated power that sometimes challenged central authority. The system's dependence on agricultural surpluses made it vulnerable to environmental disruptions. These structural problems became critical when external pressures mounted around 2000 BCE. Climate change, beginning around 2000 BCE, created agricultural stress throughout Mesopotamia. Reduced rainfall decreased crop yields just as the state required maximum resources to defend against external threats. The elaborate redistribution system that had been Ur III's strength became a liability when surpluses disappeared. Provincial territories began withholding resources for local needs rather than sending them to the capital. The administrative apparatus that had managed prosperity proved unable to manage scarcity. The Elamite forces that breached Ur's walls in 2004 BCE found a city already weakened by years of internal strife and economic collapse. The last king of Ur III, Ibisin, was taken captive and transported to Susa, where Elamite inscriptions record his humiliation. The great ziggurat stood abandoned, its priests fled, its treasuries plundered. The administrative apparatus that had managed the most sophisticated state in ancient history simply ceased to function. Scribes abandoned their posts, leaving final tablets half-written. The empire that had seemed eternal dissolved within months. The power vacuum left by Ur's collapse created opportunities for ambitious leaders throughout Mesopotamia. Local strongmen who had served as provincial administrators declared independence, establishing dynasties that would compete for regional dominance. The most successful emerged in cities that controlled critical resources or trade routes. Isin, located near important religious centers, claimed to be Ur's legitimate successor. Larsa controlled access to the Persian Gulf trade. Babylon, previously insignificant, began its rise under Amorite chieftains who had infiltrated Mesopotamia during Ur III's final decades. These Amorite rulers brought different concepts of governance derived from their pastoral nomadic backgrounds. Unlike the bureaucratic Ur III state, Amorite authority rested on personal relationships, kinship networks, and military prowess. They maintained portions of Sumerian administrative tradition while introducing more flexible, personalized rule. This hybrid approach proved more resilient than rigid bureaucracy, enabling Amorite dynasties to survive the turbulent centuries following Ur's collapse. The city of Babylon emerged from obscurity under its Amorite rulers to become Mesopotamia's dominant power. Its location at the narrowest point between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers gave it strategic advantages for controlling trade and communications. The early Babylonian kings systematically expanded their territory through military conquest and diplomatic marriages. By the time Hammurabi ascended the throne in 1792 BCE, Babylon controlled sufficient resources to challenge any rival. Hammurabi's 42-year reign transformed Babylon from regional power to imperial capital. His military campaigns, carefully documented in year names and royal inscriptions, proceeded methodically. Rather than attempting immediate conquest of all Mesopotamia, Hammurabi first secured alliances, accumulated resources, and weakened rivals through diplomatic manipulation. Only after decades of preparation did he launch decisive campaigns that brought most of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. The famous law code of Hammurabi, carved on a black diorite stele discovered at Susa, represents more than legal reform. The code synthesized Sumerian legal traditions with Amorite customs, creating a hybrid system that acknowledged diverse populations within the Babylonian Empire. While the code's harsh punishments attract modern attention, its importance lies in establishing written law as the foundation for royal authority. The prologue explicitly connects Hammurabi's legitimacy to his role as lawgiver chosen by gods to establish justice. The code's 282 laws addressed property rights, commercial transactions, family relationships, and criminal justice with remarkable specificity. Different penalties applied to different social classes, institutionalizing inequality while providing some protection for all social strata. The principle of proportional retaliation, an eye for an eye, applied primarily to conflicts between social equals. When victims were of lower status than perpetrators, monetary compensation usually sufficed. This differentiated system reflected social realities while maintaining order through predictable consequences. Babylonian administration adapted Sumerian bureaucratic practices to new political realities. Rather than attempting the comprehensive control characteristic of Ur III, Babylonian officials focused on essential functions like tax collection, military recruitment, and judicial administration. Local authorities retained considerable autonomy in managing daily affairs. This decentralized approach required less administrative overhead while maintaining effective control over diverse territories. The preservation of Sumerian culture under Babylonian rule demonstrated remarkable cultural continuity despite political transformation. Babylonian kings presented themselves as heirs to ancient Mesopotamian traditions, maintaining Sumerian religious practices and supporting traditional temples. Royal inscriptions were composed in both Akkadian and Sumerian, though few could still speak the ancient language. This bilingual tradition preserved Sumerian literature, enabling modern scholars to understand the world's first written language. Educational institutions during the Old Babylonian period maintained rigorous curricula that transmitted Sumerian knowledge to new generations. Students began by copying lexical lists that preserved Sumerian vocabulary with Akkadian translations. They progressed to transcribing literary texts, mathematical problems, and legal formulas. Advanced students composed original works demonstrating mastery of classical forms. This educational system preserved not merely language, but entire intellectual traditions. The mathematical achievements of Old Babylonian scholars built upon Sumerian foundations while reaching new heights of sophistication. Babylonian mathematicians solved quadratic equations, calculated square roots, and understood Pythagorean relationships centuries before Pythagoras. Their sexagesimal system enabled complex astronomical calculations. Mathematical problem texts presented practical applications involving field measurements, construction projects, and commercial calculations. These achievements influenced mathematical development throughout the ancient world. Literary production flourished during the Old Babylonian period as scribes compiled and standardized texts transmitted from Sumerian times. The Epic of Gilgamesh reached its classic form through Babylonian redaction, transforming disparate Sumerian tales into a unified narrative exploring universal themes. Creation myths like Enuma Elish were composed or reformulated to reflect Babylonian theological perspectives. These literary works spread throughout the Near East, influencing religious and philosophical thought across cultures. The elevation of Marduk from minor agricultural deity to supreme god reflected Babylon's political ascendance. The Enuma Elish presented Marduk as champion of cosmic order, defeating primordial chaos to create the structured universe. This myth provided theological justification for Babylonian supremacy, while incorporating older Sumerian cosmological concepts. Other cities' deities were subordinated to Marduk without being eliminated, creating an inclusive theology that accommodated diverse populations. Temple institutions maintained economic importance despite increased royal power. Major temples controlled agricultural estates, operated workshops, and conducted long-distance trade. The Shamash temple at Sippar functioned as a financial institution, providing loans, managing investments, and facilitating commercial transactions. Temple archives preserve thousands of contracts documenting everything from small personal loans to large commercial ventures. These economic activities sustained religious institutions while providing essential services for urban populations. The status of women in Old Babylonian society, while subordinate to men, included legal protections and economic opportunities unknown in many ancient societies. Women could own property, conduct business, and initiate divorce under certain circumstances. The Naditu women, dedicated to temple service, managed substantial economic resources and engaged in commercial activities. Female scribes, though rare, appeared in administrative documents. These opportunities, while limited, demonstrate social complexity beyond simple patriarchal domination. Slavery in Babylonian society differed from later forms of chattel slavery. Many slaves were debt prisoners who could potentially redeem their freedom. Others were war captives integrated into households and institutions. Slaves possessed certain legal rights, could own property, and sometimes achieved manumission. The institution served economic functions in a society lacking wage labor markets. While exploitative, Babylonian slavery operated within legal frameworks that provided minimal protections. Commercial practices during the Old Babylonian period achieved remarkable sophistication. Merchants formed partnerships to finance long-distance trade expeditions. Contracts specified profit-sharing arrangements, risk allocation, and dispute resolution procedures. Credit instruments enabled transactions without physical currency transfer. Commercial law developed to handle international trade disputes. These innovations facilitated commerce across political boundaries, creating economic networks that survived political disruptions. The residential architecture of old Babylonian cities revealed social stratification and cultural values. Elite houses centered on courtyards that provided light, air circulation, and privacy. Multiple stories accommodated extended families and servants. Shrines for household gods indicated private religious practice. Smaller houses crowded narrow streets, their inhabitants sharing walls and sometimes courtyards. This architectural diversity reflected economic inequality while demonstrating shared cultural patterns. Agricultural practices continued evolving despite political instability. Date palm cultivation expanded, providing food, construction materials, and export commodities. New irrigation techniques improved water distribution efficiency. Crop rotation systems maintained soil fertility. Agricultural manuals preserved accumulated knowledge about planting schedules, pest control, and yield optimization. These advances sustained growing populations despite environmental challenges. The decline of old Babylonian power began with internal succession disputes and external pressures. Provincial governors accumulated power that challenged royal authority. Kassite tribes from the Zagros Mountains infiltrated Mesopotamian territories. Climate fluctuations disrupted agricultural production. Trade routes shifted, reducing commercial revenues. These cumulative pressures weakened Babylon's control over peripheral territories. The Hittite raid that sacked Babylon in 1595 BCE ended the dynasty Hammurabi had established, though it did not destroy Babylonian culture. The Kassites, who eventually controlled Babylon, adopted Mesopotamian traditions while introducing their own cultural elements. This pattern of conquest, followed by cultural absorption, would repeat throughout Mesopotamian history. New rulers discovered that governing complex urban societies required maintaining existing administrative and religious systems. The potter's wheel revolutionized ceramic production when it appeared in Sumerian workshops around 3500 BCE. This simple rotating platform transformed what had been a laborious hand-building process into efficient mass production. A skilled potter could shape a vessel in minutes that would have required hours using coil or slab techniques. The wheel's circular motion created perfectly symmetrical forms impossible to achieve by hand. Workshops in Uruk began producing standardized bowls, jars, and storage vessels at unprecedented scales, supporting the growing urban population's needs for food storage and preparation. The principle of rotation discovered in pottery production soon found other applications. By 3200 BCE, solid wooden wheels appeared on sledges, creating the first wheeled vehicles. These early wheels were hewn from single planks or constructed from 3 wooden sections, bound together with leather and reinforced with copper strips. The vehicles they supported were heavy, slow ox-drawn carts used primarily for transporting building materials and agricultural produce. Yet this innovation fundamentally altered human capacity to move heavy loads across long distances. The development of spoked wheels around 2000 BCE represented a crucial advancement in vehicle technology. By removing unnecessary wood from the wheel's center, craftsmen created lighter, stronger wheels that could support faster movement. Spokes distributed weight efficiently while reducing the wheel's mass. This innovation enabled the development of war chariots that transformed military tactics throughout the ancient world. The technical knowledge required to construct spoked wheels, including understanding of stress distribution and material properties, demonstrated sophisticated engineering capabilities. Maritime technology advanced parallel to land transportation. Early Sumerian boats were reed bundles waterproofed with bitumen, suitable for navigating marshes and calm rivers. By 3500 BCE, shipbuilders had developed wooden vessels with sewn plank construction, where wooden boards were literally stitched together with rope or leather before being sealed with bitumen. These boats could carry several tons of cargo along rivers and canals, enabling bulk transport that would have been impossible overland. The invention of sails around 3500 BCE multiplied the efficiency of water transport. early sails were square-rigged, made from woven reed mats or wool cloth, and could only effectively use following winds. Despite limitations, sail power enabled merchants to move larger cargoes with smaller crews. Navigation along the predictable currents of the Tigris and Euphrates became routine. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian merchants were sailing the Persian Gulf, reaching Dilmun, Magan, and possibly the Indus Valley. These voyages required understanding of seasonal winds, coastal navigation, and ship construction capable of withstanding open water. Agricultural technology underwent continuous refinement throughout Sumerian history. The scratch plough, or ayard, appeared around 4000 BCE. This simple device, essentially a pointed stick dragged through soil, enabled farmers to prepare larger fields than possible with hand tools. The addition of bronze ploughshares around 3000 BCE allowed cultivation of heavier soils. By 2500 BCE, seed drills attached to ploughs enabled simultaneous ploughing and planting, ensuring consistent seed depth and spacing that improved germination rates. Irrigation technology represented perhaps the most crucial innovation for Mesopotamian civilization. Simple flood irrigation gave way to sophisticated canal systems with controlled structures regulating water flow. The shaduf, a counterweighted lever for lifting water, appeared around 2400 BCE, enabling irrigation of fields above river level. Networks of primary, secondary, and tertiary canals distributed water across thousands of hectares. Drainage systems prevented waterlogging and controlled salination. The collective labor required for construction and maintenance of these systems drove social organization and political centralization. Metallurgy advanced from simple cold hammering of native copper to sophisticated alloying and casting techniques. The discovery that adding tin to copper produced bronze, and more durable than pure copper, revolutionized tool and weapon production. Sumerian smiths mastered the proportions required for different applications, creating alloys with specific properties. Lost wax casting enabled production of complex shapes impossible to achieve through hammering. Temperature control in furnaces achieved through bellows and furnace design allowed consistent results. The development of standardized weights and measures facilitated commerce and engineering. The Sumerian system, based on multiples of 60, created units that could be easily divided into halves, thirds, quarters, and sixths. Standard weights, often in the form of stone ducks or other shapes, were maintained in temples and markets. Length measurements based on body parts, the cubit, palm, and finger, were standardized through official measuring rods. Volume measures for grain and liquids enabled fair trade and accurate taxation. Mathematical knowledge accumulated through practical problem-solving in administration, construction, and commerce. Sumerian mathematicians developed place-value notation, enabling calculation with large numbers. They compiled tables of reciprocals, squares, and cube roots. Geometric knowledge included calculating areas of fields, volumes of granaries, and slopes of canals. The Pythagorean theorem was understood and applied centuries before Pythagoras. Mathematical problem texts presented practical scenarios requiring sophisticated calculation, training scribes in quantitative reasoning. Astronomical observations initially served religious and agricultural purposes. Priests tracked lunar phases to determine religious festivals. Farmers needed to predict seasonal floods and optimal planting times. By 2500 BCE, systematic observations had revealed periodic patterns in celestial motion. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, though compiled later, preserve observations dating to the Old Babylonian period. These records demonstrate understanding of planetary periods and ability to predict celestial events. The calendar system, reconciling lunar months with the solar year through intercalation, required sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Medical knowledge accumulated through empirical observation and trial and error experimentation. Sumerian medical texts describe symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments for various ailments. Surgical procedures included setting bones, draining abscesses, and removing cataracts. Pharmaceutical preparations used plants, minerals, and animal products in specific proportions. While medical theory included supernatural explanations, practical treatments often showed genuine therapeutic value. The Code of Hammurabi's regulations concerning medical practice indicate professional standards and accountability. Textile technology progressed from simple spinning and weaving to complex production systems. The drop spindle increased thread production efficiency. Horizontal ground looms gave way to vertical frame looms that enabled longer cloth production. Different weaving patterns created varied textures and strengths. Dyeing techniques using plant and mineral sources produced colored fabrics that became markers of social status. Fulling, the process of cleaning and thickening cloth, improved fabric quality. These innovations supported a textile industry that employed thousands and generated significant export revenue. Architectural techniques evolved to address environmental challenges and aesthetic ambitions. Mud brick construction was refined through standardization and improved composition. Adding straw prevented cracking, while bitumen waterproofed foundations. Barrel vaults and domes constructed without wooden centering demonstrated understanding of structural forces. Buttresses prevented wall collapse in tall structures. Drainage systems protected buildings from water damage. These techniques enabled construction of monuments that survived millennia. Glass production began as an accidental discovery in pottery kilns where sand and alkali combined at high temperatures. By 2500 BCE, Mesopotamian craftsmen deliberately produced glass beads and small objects. The technology required precise temperature control and understanding of chemical composition. Different additives produced various colors, with blue and green most common. Glass remained a luxury product, but its production demonstrated experimental approach to materials that characterized Sumerian craftsmanship. Food processing technologies extended storage life and improved nutrition. Fermentation produced beer and leavened bread, staples of Mesopotamian diet. Salt preservation enabled long-term storage of meat and fish. Oil pressing from sesame seeds provided cooking oil and lamp fuel. Date syrup concentrated fruit sugars for sweetening and preservation. Cheese making transformed milk into storable protein. These techniques supported urban populations dependent on food supplies transported from distant agricultural areas. The cumulative effect of these technological innovations transformed human existence. Agricultural advances enabled population growth. Transportation improvements facilitated trade and cultural exchange. Metallurgy provided tools that increased productivity across all sectors. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge enabled engineering projects and economic planning. Medical advances improved quality of life. Each innovation built upon previous discoveries, creating accelerating technological change. Technology transfer occurred through multiple channels. Skilled craftsmen moved between cities, carrying technical knowledge. Merchants observed foreign techniques and imported innovations. Military conquest exposed populations to different technologies. Diplomatic gifts often included technically sophisticated objects that could be reverse engineered. This constant exchange drove innovation as communities adopted and improved foreign techniques. The social implications of technological change were profound. Specialization increased as technologies became more complex. Social stratification intensified as those controlling advanced technologies accumulated wealth and power. Gender roles shifted as certain technologies became associated with male or female practitioners. Educational systems evolved to transmit technical knowledge. Professional associations emerged to protect trade secrets and maintain quality standards. Environmental consequences of technological exploitation became increasingly apparent. Deforestation from construction and fuel demands changed local climates. Mining operations scarred landscapes and polluted water sources. Intensive agriculture led to soil exhaustion and salinization. Urban industrial activities created air and water pollution. These environmental costs of technological progress would eventually contribute to civilization's decline in some regions. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged from Sumerian oral traditions stretching back to the 3rd millennium BCE, when the historical king ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE. Early Sumerian poems celebrated individual episodes from Gilgamesh's adventures, including his conflict with Aga of Kish, his journey to the cedar forest, and his encounter with the Bull of Heaven. These independent narratives circulated for centuries before being woven into a unified epic during the Old Babylonian period. The transformation from episodic tales to cohesive narrative represented a crucial development in world literature. The standard version of the epic, compiled by the priest Sinlekiuninni around 1100 BCE, demonstrates sophisticated literary architecture. The 12 tablets follow Gilgamesh, his transformation from tyrannical king to wisdom-seeking wanderer, to resigned mortal accepting humanity, his limitations. This character development, unprecedented in earlier literature, established patterns for heroic narratives that would influence storytelling traditions across cultures. The epic's exploration of friendship, mortality, and the meaning of human existence resonated far beyond its Mesopotamian origins. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu introduced literary themes that would echo through subsequent traditions. Enkidu's creation as a wild man who becomes civilized through human contact explored the boundary between nature and culture. His death catalyzed Gilgamesh's existential crisis, driving the hero's futile quest for immortality. This narrative structure, where loss motivates spiritual journey, appeared in later traditions from Greek mythology to medieval romance. The emotional depth of Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu created a model for depicting human suffering in literature. The flood narrative embedded within the epic provided one of several Mesopotamian sources for flood traditions that spread throughout the ancient Near East. Utnapishtim's account of divine destruction and human survival through boat building paralleled earlier Sumerian versions featuring Ziusudra and later Akkadian accounts of Atrahasis. These Mesopotamian flood stories influenced the biblical account of Noah, though with significant theological reinterpretation. The persistence of flood narratives across cultures suggests both shared literary heritage and possibly common memories of catastrophic flooding. Sumerian wisdom literature established genres and themes that shaped intellectual traditions throughout the ancient world. The instructions of Shuruppak, dating to at least 2500 BCE, provided moral guidance through practical advice and ethical principles. This text influenced later wisdom traditions, including Egyptian instructions and biblical proverbs. The format of elder advising younger, the emphasis on social harmony, and the integration of practical and ethical guidance became standard features of wisdom literature across cultures. The Sumerian disputations, verbal contests between personified entities, created a literary form that spread throughout the Near East. The dispute between sheep and grain, bird and fish, summer and winter, and similar compositions presented opposing viewpoints through elegant rhetoric. These texts served educational purposes, training scribes in argumentation while transmitting cultural values. The disputation format influenced later philosophical dialogues and theological debates, establishing conventions for presenting competing ideas through literary discourse. Lamentations over destroyed cities represented another influential Sumerian literary innovation. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, composed around 2000 BCE, established conventions for expressing collective grief through poetic form. The personification of cities as abandoned women, the detailed cataloguing of destruction, and the theological interpretation of disaster as divine punishment became standard elements in later lamentations. These Sumerian models influenced biblical lamentations, and established patterns for literary responses to collective trauma. Sumerian proverbs preserved folk wisdom in memorable formulations that transcended linguistic barriers. Collections of proverbs served educational purposes while transmitting cultural values across generations. Many Sumerian proverbs were translated into Akkadian and other languages, spreading their insights throughout the ancient world. The emphasis on industriousness, social harmony, and respect for authority found in Sumerian proverbs appeared in similar collections from Egypt to India, suggesting either direct influence or parallel social development. The transmission of Sumerian literature required continuous effort from scribal schools that maintained texts long after Sumerian ceased being spoken. Old Babylonian scribes created bilingual editions with interlinear Akkadian translations. Assyrian scholars compiled comprehensive editions in the libraries of Assur and Nineveh. Persian period scribes continued copying classical texts. This multi-generational effort preserved Sumerian literature through political upheavals, ensuring its influence on subsequent traditions. Mathematical knowledge developed in Sumerian schools spread throughout the ancient world through commercial and diplomatic contacts. The sexagesimal system, based on 60, influenced mathematical traditions from India to Greece. Babylonian mathematical texts were translated into Greek, contributing to Hellenistic mathematical development. The concept of place value notation, revolutionary for enabling calculation with large numbers, spread eastward to India and eventually worldwide. Sumerian mathematical innovations thus contributed to global mathematical heritage. Astronomical observations recorded by Sumerian and Babylonian scholars provided data used by later astronomers for centuries. Greek astronomers, including Hipparchus and Ptolemy, relied on Babylonian observations to develop their cosmic models. The division of the circle into 360 degrees derived from the Sumerian calendar and number system became universal in astronomy and geometry. Babylonian planetary theory influenced Indian and Islamic astronomy, contributing to astronomical traditions that eventually produced modern science. Legal concepts developed in Sumerian law codes influenced juridical traditions throughout the Near East and beyond. The principle of written law as foundation for justice spread from Mesopotamia to surrounding cultures. The format of law codes, with prologues establishing royal authority and epilogues invoking divine sanction, appeared in legal texts from Anatolia to Israel. Specific legal provisions concerning property, contracts, and family relations showed clear Mesopotamian influence in Hittite, Assyrian, and biblical law. Religious concepts originating in Sumerian temples influenced theological development across the ancient world. The organization of divine hierarchies with supreme deities ruling subordinate gods provided models for polytheistic systems. The concept of personal gods who protected individuals while mediating with higher powers appeared in various forms throughout the Near East. Myths explaining creation through divine conflict and ordering of chaos influenced cosmological thinking from Egypt to Greece. The Sumerian concept of divine destiny, or Shimtu, influenced ideas about fate and predestination across cultures. The notion that gods determined individual and collective fates while allowing some human agency created theological frameworks adopted by various traditions. This balance between divine sovereignty and human responsibility appeared in modified forms in biblical, Greek, and Persian religious thought. The Tablet of Destinies, a Sumerian concept of divine authority over fate, influenced ideas about cosmic order. Architectural innovations pioneered in Sumerian cities spread throughout the ancient world. The ziggurat form influenced stepped pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, though independent invention cannot be ruled out. The courtyard house plan developed in Mesopotamian cities became standard throughout the Mediterranean. Construction techniques, including arch and vault construction, spread from Mesopotamia to Roman architecture. Urban planning principles first implemented in Sumerian cities influenced city design across cultures. Agricultural techniques developed in Mesopotamian fields transformed farming practices across Eurasia. Irrigation methods spread to Egypt, Iran, and Central Asia, enabling cultivation in arid regions. Crop rotation systems and fallowing practices maintained soil fertility. The integration of agriculture and animal husbandry, with animals providing fertilizer and traction while crops provided fodder, created sustainable farming systems. These innovations supported population growth and urbanization far from their Mesopotamian origins. Commercial practices pioneered by Sumerian merchants established foundations for international trade. Written contracts, credit instruments, and partnership agreements facilitated long-distance commerce. Standard weights and measures enabled fair exchange. Commercial law developed to resolve trade disputes. These innovations spread along trade routes, creating commercial networks that connected diverse cultures. The concept of interest-bearing loans developed in Mesopotamian temples influenced financial systems worldwide, despite religious prohibitions in some traditions. Educational methods developed in Sumerian schools influenced pedagogical traditions across cultures. The systematic curriculum progressing from basic literacy through advanced specialized knowledge provided models for educational systems. The use of standardized exercises, reference texts, and examinations established educational practices that persisted for millennia. The concept of formal education as preparation for administrative careers influenced educational development in China, India, and the Mediterranean world. The influence of Sumerian civilization on biblical tradition deserves special attention, given its cultural significance. Abraham's origin in Ur connected Israelite tradition directly to Mesopotamian heritage. Biblical creation accounts, flood narratives, and legal codes showed clear Mesopotamian influence while being transformed by monotheistic theology. Wisdom literature, including Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, employed literary forms and themes derived from Mesopotamian precedents. Understanding these connections illuminates both traditions while respecting their distinct theological developments. The preservation of Sumerian influence through successive conquests demonstrated the civilization's foundational importance. Akkadian conquerors adopted Sumerian culture. Babylonian rulers claimed Sumerian heritage. Assyrian kings collected Sumerian texts. Persian administrators maintained Mesopotamian traditions. Each conquest could have erased Sumerian influence, yet each conqueror found Sumerian innovations essential for governing complex societies. This pattern revealed the practical value of Sumerian achievements beyond their original cultural context. The rediscovery of ancient Mesopotamia began almost by accident, when European travelers in the early 19th century encountered strange mounds rising from the flat Iraqi plains. These tells, as local Arabs called them, concealed the remains of cities that had been forgotten for over 2 millennia. Paul-Émile Botta, French consul at Mosul, began excavating at Khorsabad in 1843, believing he had found biblical Nineveh. Though he had actually uncovered Sargon the Skim's Assyrian capital, his discoveries of massive winged bulls and cuneiform-covered walls sparked European fascination with Mesopotamian antiquity. Austen Henry Layard's excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh between 1845 and 1851 transformed Mesopotamian archaeology from treasure hunting into systematic investigation. Layard developed methods for recording architectural remains and artifact positions that provided context for interpreting discoveries. His workers uncovered Ashurbanipal's library, containing thousands of cuneiform tablets that would prove essential for understanding Mesopotamian civilization. These texts included the Epic of Gilgamesh, mathematical treatises, and historical chronicles that opened windows into ancient thought and culture. The decipherment of cuneiform script represented one of the 19th century's greatest intellectual achievements. Georg Friedrich Grotefend made initial breakthroughs in 1802 by identifying Persian royal names in trilingual inscriptions. Henry Rawlinson expanded this work through his dangerous copying of the Behistun inscription, suspended on ropes hundreds of feet above ground. By comparing Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian versions of the same text, scholars gradually decoded the cuneiform writing system that had been forgotten since antiquity. The recognition that many cuneiform texts were written in a non-Semitic language revolutionized understanding of Mesopotamian history. Jules Aupert identified this language as Sumerian in 1869, though controversy continued for decades about whether Sumerians actually existed as a distinct people. The discovery of purely Sumerian texts at sites like Tello and Nippur confirmed that an unknown civilization had preceded the Babylonians and Assyrians, fundamentally altering conceptions of human history. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur from 1922 to 1934 captured public imagination through spectacular discoveries and meticulous documentation. The royal cemetery's golden artifacts and evidence of human sacrifice demonstrated Sumerian civilization's sophistication and complexity. Woolley's discovery of flood deposits beneath Sumerian occupation levels seemed to confirm biblical flood narratives, though later research revealed these were local rather than universal floods. His popular writings brought Sumerian civilization to general audiences, establishing public interest that continues today. The excavation of Uruk by German teams beginning in 1912 revealed the world's first city and earliest writing. The deep soundings at Uruk traced urban development from prehistoric villages through the emergence of monumental architecture and administrative complexity. The discovery of thousands of archaic tablets provided direct evidence for writing's invention. These excavations established stratigraphic sequences that became chronological frameworks for understanding Mesopotamian development. Archaeological methods evolved dramatically during the 20th century. Earlier excavators had focused on monumental architecture and valuable artifacts. Modern archaeologists employed systematic survey techniques, environmental sampling, and quantitative analysis. Regional surveys mapped settlement patterns across entire landscapes. Satellite imagery revealed ancient canal systems and roads invisible from ground level. These methods transformed understanding from individual sites to entire cultural systems. The translation and publication of cuneiform texts accelerated as scholars developed better understanding of Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary and Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary provided comprehensive reference works. Digital databases made hundreds of thousands of texts accessible to researchers worldwide. Machine learning algorithms began assisting in text recognition and translation. These tools exponentially increased the pace of philological research. Contemporary understanding of Sumerian civilization continues evolving through new discoveries and interpretative frameworks. Recent excavations at sites like Tel Khaibar and Tel Zirgal provide fresh data about periods poorly represented in earlier excavations. Environmental archaeology reveals climate changes that influenced cultural development. Isotope analysis traces ancient trade networks. DNA analysis examines population movements. These scientific techniques answer questions that traditional archaeology alone could not address. The preservation of Mesopotamian heritage faces severe challenges from military conflict, economic development, and climate change. The Iraq War caused catastrophic damage to archaeological sites and museums. ISIS deliberately destroyed monuments at Nimrud and Palmyra. Illegal excavation and antiquities trafficking destroy irreplaceable cultural heritage. Dam construction threatens to flood archaeological sites. These losses make preserving and studying existing materials increasingly urgent. Modern scholars debate fundamental questions about Sumerian civilization's origins and nature. The relationship between indigenous development and external influences remains controversial. Some scholars emphasize continuity from Ubaid through Uruk periods, while others identify significant population movements. The degree of political unity versus fragmentation in early periods generates ongoing discussion. These debates reflect evolving theoretical frameworks and new archaeological evidence. The influence of Sumerian discoveries on contemporary thought extends beyond academic circles. The realization that complex civilization existed 5,000 years ago challenged narratives of inevitable progress. Evidence of environmental degradation and societal collapse provides warnings about contemporary challenges. The invention of writing demonstrated human creative capacity, while revealing how knowledge transmission shapes culture. These insights influence fields from environmental policy to information science. Digital humanities projects make Sumerian culture increasingly accessible to global audiences. Virtual reconstructions allow people to explore ancient cities. Online exhibitions display artifacts from worldwide collections. Translation projects make Sumerian literature available in multiple languages. Educational games teach cuneiform writing. These initiatives democratize access to cultural heritage previously restricted to specialists. The ethical dimensions of studying Sumerian civilization raise important questions about cultural patrimony and scholarly responsibility. Should artifacts removed during colonial periods be repatriated? How should indigenous communities be involved in archaeological research? What responsibilities do scholars have to descendant communities? These questions reflect broader discussions about decolonizing archaeology and ensuring equitable access to cultural heritage. The relevance of Sumerian innovations to contemporary challenges appears increasingly clear. Ancient irrigation systems inform modern water management in arid regions. Traditional construction techniques using local materials provide sustainable alternatives to energy-intensive modern methods. Community organization patterns observed in early cities suggest models for urban planning. Understanding how Sumerians adapted to environmental changes offers insights for addressing climate change. Educational initiatives incorporating Sumerian history demonstrate the civilization's continuing pedagogical value. Teaching about the invention of writing helps students understand communication technologies. Examining Sumerian mathematics reveals non-Western contributions to scientific knowledge. Studying early cities introduces concepts of social complexity and political organization. These lessons challenge Eurocentric curricula while developing critical thinking skills. The economic lessons from Sumerian civilization resonate with contemporary discussions about inequality and sustainability. The concentration of wealth in early cities parallels modern economic disparities. The collapse of over-centralized states warns against rigid institutional structures. The relationship between environmental degradation and societal decline demonstrates ecological limits. These historical patterns inform debates about economic justice and environmental policy. Sumerian contributions to human artistic heritage continue inspiring contemporary creators. Modern artists incorporate cuneiform script and cylinder seal designs into their work. Musicians experiment with reconstructions of ancient instruments. Writers adapt Sumerian myths for contemporary audiences. These creative engagements demonstrate the enduring power of Sumerian cultural expressions. The philosophical implications of Sumerian texts challenge Western philosophical traditions. Sumerian concepts of fate and free will predate Greek philosophical discussions. Their understanding of humanity's relationship with nature differs from later anthropocentric views. Sumerian wisdom literature addresses existential questions with perspectives distinct from subsequent traditions. Engaging with these ideas enriches philosophical discourse. The study of Sumerian religion contributes to comparative religious studies and interfaith dialogue. Understanding polytheistic systems helps modern readers comprehend religious diversity. Recognizing Mesopotamian influences on biblical tradition illuminates Abrahamic religion's historical development. Sumerian theological concepts provide alternatives to dominant religious paradigms. This knowledge promotes religious literacy and mutual understanding. The technological legacy of Sumerian civilization underscores humanity's innovative capacity. From the wheel to writing, Sumerian inventions transformed human possibilities. Understanding innovation in historical context reveals that progress requires favorable social and environmental conditions. Recognizing ancient technological achievements challenges assumptions about primitive societies. These insights inform discussions about innovation, development, and human potential. The story of Sumerian civilization ultimately demonstrates both human achievement and vulnerability. The Sumerians created institutions, technologies, and cultural forms that enabled unprecedented social complexity. Yet their civilization eventually disappeared, absorbed into successive empires. This combination of innovation and impermanence reflects universal human experiences. Understanding Sumerian history provides perspective on contemporary civilizations' achievements and challenges. The ongoing recovery and interpretation of Sumerian heritage represents humanity's effort to understand its deepest roots. Each translated tablet, excavated building, and analyzed artifact adds details to our understanding of how complex societies emerged. The questions Sumerians asked about meaning, justice, and mortality remain relevant today. Their solutions, while specific to their context, offer insights into enduring human challenges. As archaeological research continues and new technologies enable fresh discoveries, our understanding of Sumerian civilization will undoubtedly evolve. Future excavations may reveal unknown cities or earlier developmental stages. Advances in text analysis might unlock currently incomprehensible documents. Environmental research could clarify climate impacts on cultural change. These future discoveries will build upon foundations established by 2 centuries of scholarship. The legacy of Sumerian civilization extends far beyond academic knowledge. The Sumerians demonstrated that humans could create complex societies, develop sophisticated technologies, and produce enduring cultural achievements. They showed that cooperation could accomplish projects beyond individual capability. They proved that knowledge could be preserved across generations through writing. These achievements established possibilities that continue shaping human civilization 5,000 years later.